I would rather stand than sit there. The words cut through the quiet first-class cabin so sharply that several passengers looked up at once. A flight attendant froze beside the aisle, her practiced smile slipping for just a second. The soft hum of the aircraft suddenly felt louder. Rebecca Whitmore stood with one hand resting on the top of a leather seat, her tailored cream-colored coat draped perfectly over her shoulders. She glanced from her boarding pass to the man seated beside the window. Then she looked back at the flight attendant. "There must be another seat available," she said. "First class is completely full this evening, ma'am," the attendant replied carefully. Rebecca's expression tightened. Outside the window, rain rolled down the glass beneath the glow of airport floodlights. Passengers continued boarding while flight attendants moved efficiently through the cabin. Yet all attention seemed fixed on row 2. The man sitting in seat 2B never said a word. Elijah Brooks simply looked out the window as if none of this involved him. He wore a dark brown jacket that showed signs of years of use. A plain carry-on rested beneath the seat in front of him. Across his lap sat a thick manila envelope secured with a faded elastic band. Nothing about him appeared remarkable. Nothing that Rebecca considered worthy of a first-class seat. "I paid for privacy," Rebecca continued. "I have an important meeting tomorrow." The flight attendant maintained her composure. "I understand, ma'am, but these are the assigned seats." A few nearby passengers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Elijah remained calm. He did not roll his eyes. He did not argue. He simply adjusted the envelope on his lap and returned his attention to the rain outside. Somehow his silence irritated Rebecca even more. She finally lowered herself into the seat with obvious reluctance. The leather cushion shifted beneath her. She immediately opened her laptop and began reviewing documents related to the largest business deal of her career. If everything went according to plan, the following afternoon would change her future forever. $800 million. One signature. One final meeting in Seattle. Her company had spent nearly a year preparing for it. Beside her, Elijah quietly removed a pair of reading glasses and opened the envelope. Rebecca barely glanced over before returning to her work. Yet she noticed enough to see pages filled with reports, handwritten notes, and several names highlighted in yellow marker. Elijah studied the documents carefully. Occasionally his expression changed as though something concerned him. The captain welcomed passengers aboard. Overhead bins clicked shut. Engines began to rumble beneath the cabin floor. Outside, the rain intensified. Rebecca focused on numbers, projections, and contracts. Across the aisle, investors and executives discussed markets and acquisitions. Everything felt familiar, predictable, controlled. Then Elijah paused while reading. His eyes stopped on a single page. He read the same line twice. Slowly, his gaze shifted toward Rebecca's laptop screen. For the first time during the entire boarding process, concern crossed his face. He looked down at the name highlighted on his document. Then he looked back toward Rebecca. Outside, lightning flashed behind distant clouds. Elijah closed the folder quietly. Rebecca never noticed. She should have. The aircraft pushed away from the gate and began taxiing through sheets of rain that blurred the airport lights into long streaks of gold and white. Inside the cabin, conversations faded as passengers settled into the familiar rhythm of a cross-country flight. Rebecca Whitmore barely noticed. Her attention remained fixed on the glowing screen in front of her. Rows of numbers, acquisition forecasts, and investor summaries filled the display. Every figure represented months of preparation. Every page pointed toward the meeting waiting for her in Seattle. Across the aisle, executives reviewed presentations of their own. A few recognized Rebecca and nodded respectfully. She returned polite smiles without looking away from her work. Success had become routine. Winning had become expected. Beside her, Elijah Brooks quietly reopened the manila envelope. The documents inside appeared ordinary at first glance. Financial reports, corporate filings, risk assessments. Yet the deeper he read, the more concerned he became. Several names repeated throughout the pages. One in particular appeared again and again. Elijah adjusted his glasses and read the entry a second time. Then a third. The expression on his face darkened slightly. Outside the window, the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Moments later, the city lights dropped away beneath the clouds. The cabin tilted gently as the jet climbed into the night sky. Rebecca finally leaned back and closed her laptop for a moment. She glanced toward Elijah by accident rather than intention. He was studying the papers with intense concentration. His finger rested beside a highlighted name, the same name she had seen briefly reflected in the screen of her own laptop during boarding. For an instant, a strange feeling crossed her mind. Recognition, perhaps. Then she dismissed it and reopened her presentation. 30 minutes later, the seatbelt sign switched off. Flight attendants began serving drinks and meals. The atmosphere relaxed. Rain faded behind them. The aircraft leveled at cruising altitude. Elijah folded one document and carefully returned it to the envelope. Then he looked toward Rebecca, not with annoyance, not with judgment, with concern. He hesitated for several seconds before speaking. "Excuse me," he said politely. Rebecca looked up. "Yes, I could be mistaken," Elijah replied, "but I believe I saw a company name on your screen earlier." Rebecca immediately stiffened. "And?" Elijah glanced down at the folder. "I have spent the past year reviewing corporate risk reports. If your company is connected to a firm called Raven Capital Holdings, there may be something important you should know." Rebecca stared at him. The name was correct. Raven Capital was at the center of tomorrow's acquisition. Yet instead of curiosity, irritation surfaced. "I do not discuss business matters with strangers," she said. Elijah nodded slowly. "I understand. Then I think this conversation is over." Her tone was sharp enough to end the discussion. Elijah remained silent for a moment. He looked at the envelope in his hands. Then he carefully closed it. "Very well," he said. "I hope I am wrong." Rebecca returned to her laptop. The exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. By the time she resumed reading her reports, she had already forgotten it. Elijah had not. He looked once more at the highlighted documents resting inside the envelope. Then he stared out into the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere beneath the clouds, a chain of events was already moving forward. And the woman sitting beside him had just ignored the one warning that might have changed everything. For the next hour, the flight settled into a deceptive calm. The turbulence disappeared. The cabin lights dimmed. Passengers reclined their seats and returned to the comfortable routines of long-distance travel. Rebecca Whitmore reviewed presentation slides one after another, making minor adjustments to charts she had already examined dozens of times. Every projection looked strong. Every forecast supported the acquisition. According to the reports in front of her, tomorrow would be a triumph. Across the aisle, two venture capital executives discussed market trends over glasses of sparkling water. A few rows ahead, a technology founder slept beneath a blanket. Everything felt ordinary, predictable, safe. Yet beside the window, Elijah Brooks could not shake the feeling growing in the back of his mind. He opened the manila envelope again. The pages inside were arranged with meticulous care. Corporate structures, ownership records, regulatory filings, transaction histories. Several names had been circled. Several companies connected through layers of shell entities spread across multiple states. Elijah had spent months reviewing information like this. Patterns mattered. Small details mattered. And the pattern he was seeing now disturbed him. He removed a single document and studied it beneath the reading light. The highlighted name appeared again. Raven Capital Holdings. Slowly, he turned the page. Then another. His expression tightened. A flight attendant stopped beside his seat. "Can I bring you anything, sir?" she asked. Elijah smiled politely. "Just coffee, thank you." When she returned, he thanked her by name after reading her badge. The simple gesture earned a surprised smile. Rebecca noticed the exchange without meaning to. For a moment, she glanced toward the envelope again. Curiosity surfaced briefly. Then her phone vibrated. A message from her chief financial officer appeared on the screen. "Everything ready for tomorrow. Investors confirmed. Final signatures expected by noon." Rebecca allowed herself a small smile. She had spent 15 years climbing toward opportunities like this. 15 years proving herself in rooms dominated by older executives who underestimated her. Tomorrow would validate every sacrifice. Across from her, Elijah stared at another page. This time he recognized a familiar address. A company he had investigated years earlier. The connection was indirect but unmistakable. His pulse quickened slightly. He reached for a pen and underlined several lines. Then he looked toward Rebecca once more. She was reviewing the exact transaction structure connected to the names inside his file. The realization settled heavily in his chest. She was walking toward a problem she could not see. The seatbelt sign chimed unexpectedly as the aircraft entered a patch of light turbulence. Several passengers looked up. Coffee rippled inside paper cups. Outside the windows, moonlight reflected across a sea of clouds stretching endlessly beneath the aircraft. Elijah closed the file and leaned back. He had already tried once. She had made it clear she wanted nothing from him. Still, the concern remained. He looked toward Rebecca one final time. She never looked up. Her attention remained fixed on numbers and signatures. Somewhere ahead, beyond the clouds and beyond the city lights waiting in Seattle, decisions had already been made by people neither of them had met. Rebecca believed she was flying toward the greatest success of her life. Elijah was beginning to fear she was flying toward something else entirely. Another hour passed. The cabin lights dimmed further as most passengers settled into the quiet stillness of the overnight flight. Outside the windows, the clouds glowed faintly beneath the moonlight, creating the illusion that the aircraft was floating above an endless silver ocean. Rebecca Whitmore reviewed the final version of her presentation for what felt like the 10th time. Every slide reinforced the same conclusion. The acquisition was sound. The investors were committed. The future looked secure. Yet for reasons she could not explain, she found herself distracted. Several times her attention drifted toward the man seated beside the window. Elijah Brooks remained focused on the documents inside the manila envelope. Occasionally he would underline a sentence, circle a name, or make a brief note in the margin. Whatever he was studying clearly mattered to him. A flight attendant stopped by again to collect empty cups. As she reached their row, Elijah closed the file and thanked her. The attendant smiled warmly before continuing down the aisle. Rebecca noticed something she had not expected. Nearly everyone who interacted with Elijah seemed to respond positively. There was a quiet confidence about him. Not the loud confidence of executives seeking attention, but something steadier, something earned. She quickly dismissed the thought and returned to her laptop. Moments later, her phone vibrated. A message from one of her senior analysts appeared on the screen. Everything is confirmed. Raven Capital representatives have already arrived in Seattle. Looking forward to tomorrow. Rebecca smiled faintly. Relief washed over her. The deal was moving exactly as planned. Beside her, Elijah happened to glance toward the illuminated message. The name Raven Capital caught his eye immediately. His expression changed. This time there was no uncertainty. He reopened the envelope and searched through several pages with growing urgency. Finally, he stopped on a report near the back. A red annotation stretched across the top of the page. Elijah stared at it for several seconds before exhaling slowly. Then he turned toward Rebecca once more. "I apologize for bringing this up again," he said quietly. Rebecca looked up, clearly annoyed. "I thought we finished this conversation." Elijah nodded. "I know. But if Raven Capital is involved in tomorrow's meeting, I believe you should at least look at this." He carefully removed a single sheet from the folder. Rebecca glanced at it without taking it. "I'm not interested. You have not even read it. And I do not intend to." Her voice remained controlled, but the irritation underneath was impossible to miss. Several nearby passengers briefly looked in their direction before returning to their own conversations. Elijah lowered the document. "All right." Rebecca closed her laptop with a sharp motion. "You do not know my business. You do not know my company. And you certainly do not know what tomorrow means to me." Elijah listened without reacting. "You are right," he replied calmly. "I do not know everything. I only know what I found." The simplicity of his answer somehow frustrated her even more. She turned away and stared out the window. The conversation was over. For several minutes, neither person spoke. Eventually, Elijah returned the document to the envelope and secured it beneath the elastic band. Then he leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. Rebecca felt a brief sense of satisfaction. She had protected her focus, protected her plans, protected the future she had worked so hard to build. Yet as the aircraft continued west through the darkness, neither of them noticed the irony hanging quietly between them. The one piece of information Rebecca refused to hear was the very thing that could have saved her from what was waiting on the ground. Several hours later, the cabin had grown almost completely silent. Most passengers slept beneath thin airline blankets while soft reading lights glowed above a scattered few who remained awake. The aircraft continued west through the darkness, crossing invisible state lines high above the clouds. Rebecca Whitmore finally closed her laptop and rubbed her eyes. The presentation was finished. The contracts were ready. There was nothing left to do except arrive in Seattle and complete the deal. For the first time all evening, she allowed herself to relax. Outside the window, the night sky stretched endlessly beyond the wing. The moon reflected off distant cloud tops like silver waves. Beside her, Elijah Brooks remained awake. The manila envelope rested on the tray table in front of him. He had not opened it again for nearly an hour. Instead, he sat quietly watching the darkness outside. Rebecca glanced toward him briefly. The tension from their earlier conversation had settled into an uncomfortable silence. Neither seemed interested in speaking. A flight attendant moved through the aisle collecting empty cups. As she passed their row, she handed Elijah a folded note. "This was left for you by a passenger a few rows back," she said softly. Elijah thanked her and opened it. Rebecca looked away, but curiosity lingered. Elijah read the message, then folded it carefully and slipped it into the envelope. A faint expression crossed his face. Not surprise. Confirmation. He reopened the file and reviewed several pages again. This time his movements seemed slower, more deliberate. Whatever doubts he had carried earlier appeared to be disappearing. Rebecca returned her attention to the window. Yet a strange feeling remained. Twice tonight the same man had tried to warn her about Raven Capital. Twice she had dismissed him. Normally she would have forgotten such an encounter immediately. Instead, it continued to linger in the back of her mind. Her phone vibrated against the armrest. A new message had arrived from her chief legal officer. She opened it casually, expecting another routine update. The smile faded from her face almost instantly. "Need to discuss something when you land. Nothing urgent. Just call me first." Rebecca frowned. The wording felt unusual. Her legal officer never sent vague messages. She typed a quick response asking what was wrong. No reply came. Several minutes passed. The message remained unread. A small knot formed in her stomach. Across the aisle, another passenger quietly switched on a news channel. The volume was low, barely audible over the engines. A financial headline flashed across the screen for only a moment before disappearing. Rebecca caught a glimpse of the name Raven Capital before the broadcast changed to another story. Her pulse quickened slightly. It was probably nothing. Large investment firms appeared in financial news every day. Still, the timing felt unsettling. She looked toward Elijah without realizing it. He happened to be looking toward her at the same moment. Neither spoke. Then Elijah lowered his eyes to the envelope and gently secured the elastic band around it once more. Rebecca turned away and stared into the darkness beyond the window. Somewhere below them, cities slept beneath the night sky. Somewhere ahead, Seattle waited. And for the first time since boarding the plane, Rebecca began to wonder whether the future she had been counting on was already beginning to change. The first pale light of morning appeared beyond the aircraft windows as the captain announced their descent into Seattle. The cabin slowly came back to life. Reading lights switched off. Seatbacks returned upright. Passengers gathered laptops, jackets, and briefcases while flight attendants prepared the cabin for landing. Rebecca Whitmore looked out at the horizon where shades of blue and gold stretched above the clouds. Normally she loved this moment. A new city, a new opportunity, another victory waiting on the ground. Today felt different. The message from her legal officer lingered in her thoughts. "Need to discuss something when you land. Nothing urgent. Just call me first." The words sounded calm, yet something about them refused to leave her mind. Beside her, Elijah Brooks remained composed. The manila envelope rested securely inside his carry-on. Whatever concern had occupied him throughout the flight seemed settled now. He no longer reviewed documents. He no longer studied reports. Instead, he simply watched the morning light spread across the clouds below. Rebecca found herself looking toward him more often than she intended. She still did not trust his warning. Yet she could not ignore the fact that he had recognized the name Raven Capital before anyone else. The aircraft descended through a layer of clouds, and the city slowly emerged beneath them. Seattle's skyline reflected the early sunlight. Roads glistened from overnight rain. Ferries moved across the water like tiny white shapes. As the plane lowered toward the runway, Rebecca's phone connected briefly to the cellular network. Notifications appeared instantly across the screen. Emails, messages, missed calls. More than she expected. Her stomach tightened. 3 missed calls from her legal officer. 2 from her chief financial officer. 1 from a board member who never called outside scheduled meetings. Before she could open any of them, the signal disappeared again as the aircraft continued its descent. A few rows ahead, someone quietly turned on a phone and frowned. Another passenger checked a news alert and whispered something to his colleague. Rebecca noticed, but could not hear the words. The runway rushed toward them. Moments later, the wheels touched the ground with a firm jolt. Reverse thrust echoed through the cabin. Passengers released relieved breaths. The flight was over. Yet as the aircraft taxied toward the terminal, Rebecca felt a growing sense that something else was only beginning. When the seatbelt sign finally switched off, passengers immediately stood and reached for luggage. Rebecca remained seated for a moment while reopening her phone. This time the signal held. A flood of new notifications appeared. Her eyes moved quickly across the headlines. One message stood out instantly. Regulatory inquiry launched into multiple firms connected to Raven Capital Holdings. Another followed seconds later. Emergency board meeting requested. Then another. Investor concerns escalating. Rebecca stared at the screen. Around her, passengers continued filing into the aisle, unaware that the foundation beneath her carefully planned future had just begun to crack. Across the row, Elijah quietly stood and lifted his carry-on. For a brief moment his eyes met hers. He said nothing. He did not need to. The look on Rebecca's face told him she had finally seen the first sign of the storm waiting outside the airplane door. Rebecca remained seated long after most passengers had left the aircraft. The flow of travelers moved past her into the jet bridge while notification after notification continued appearing on her phone. Regulatory inquiry launched. Emergency investor review. Urgent legal consultation requested. Each message seemed more serious than the last. The confidence she had carried onto the plane was disappearing with alarming speed. Finally, she stood, collected her laptop bag, and stepped into the terminal. Seattle-Tacoma International Airport was already busy despite the early hour. Travelers hurried toward baggage claim. Coffee shops filled with morning customers. Flight announcements echoed through the terminal. Rebecca barely noticed any of it. She immediately called her chief legal officer. The call connected before the first ring finished. "Where are you?" he asked. His voice sounded strained. "I just landed. You need to come directly to the office." Rebecca stopped walking. "Tell me what happened." There was a long pause. Federal regulators opened an inquiry less than 2 hours ago. Rebecca felt the blood drain from her face. Into Raven Capital? Into every company connected to them. She tightened her grip on the phone. "That is impossible. I wish it were." The call ended a few minutes later, leaving her standing in the middle of the terminal while people flowed around her like water around a stone. Across the concourse, a television mounted above a cafe displayed a financial news network. A headline scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Several investment groups linked to ongoing investigation. Rebecca recognized one of the names immediately. It was a company scheduled to participate in her acquisition that afternoon. Her stomach sank. She continued toward the exit, moving faster now. Outside, gray clouds hung low over the city. Rainwater still glistened on the pavement from the night before. A black car waited at the curb. As soon as she entered the back seat, her phone rang again. This time it was a board member. Then another. Then an investor. Every conversation brought another piece of bad news. Questions were spreading faster than answers. Confidence was evaporating. By the time the car reached downtown Seattle, Rebecca no longer felt like a chief executive officer heading toward the most important meeting of her career. She felt like someone racing toward a fire she could not stop. The elevator ride to the 32nd floor seemed endless. When the doors finally opened, the atmosphere inside the office felt completely different from the day before. Employees spoke in hushed voices. Conference room doors remained closed. Several executives stood together reviewing documents with worried expressions. Rebecca entered the main boardroom. Her legal officer was already waiting. A stack of reports covered the table. "How bad is it?" she asked. He slid a folder toward her. Rebecca opened it. The first page contained names. The second contained transaction records. The third contained a network of connections between companies she had never heard of before. Yet all of them led back to the same place. Raven Capital Holdings. Rebecca stared at the pages. Then a memory surfaced with painful clarity. A man sitting beside a window. A worn manila envelope. A calm voice saying there may be something important you should know. For the first time since landing, she stopped thinking about the investigation. She started thinking about Elijah Brooks. The rest of the morning unraveled faster than Rebecca Whitmore could process. By 10 o'clock, the conference room that had been prepared for celebration felt more like a crisis center. Financial advisors moved in and out carrying folders. Attorneys spoke in low voices near the windows overlooking downtown Seattle. Every few minutes another phone rang. Another email arrived. Another question surfaced without an answer. Rebecca sat at the head of the table, staring at documents spread before her. The acquisition that had once seemed certain now appeared dangerously unstable. Several investors had already requested delays. Others were considering withdrawing completely until the investigation surrounding Raven Capital became clearer. The confidence that had surrounded the deal only 24 hours earlier had evaporated. A large screen mounted on the wall displayed financial news coverage. Analysts debated the growing story. Industry experts speculated about hidden liabilities and undisclosed relationships between investment firms. Every mention of Raven Capital tightened the knot in Rebecca's stomach. Her chief financial officer entered carrying a tablet. His expression alone told her the news would not be good. "Another partner has suspended negotiations," he said quietly. Rebecca closed her eyes. "How many does that make?" "3. Silence settled across the room. Outside the windows, clouds drifted above the city skyline. Ferries moved slowly across Elliott Bay. Life continued normally beyond the glass, while everything inside felt increasingly fragile. Rebecca stood and walked toward the window. For years, she had believed preparation could solve almost anything. Yet no amount of preparation could change one uncomfortable truth. Someone had tried to warn her. Someone had seen the danger before anyone else. And she had refused to listen. She returned to the table and opened the investigation file again. This time she paid attention to details she had overlooked before. Near the back of the report, she found a reference to an independent corporate risk consultant whose analysis had helped regulators identify suspicious financial patterns months earlier. Her eyes moved to the name, Elijah Brooks. Rebecca stared at the page. For a moment, the noise of the room faded away. The man sitting beside her on the airplane had not been guessing. He had not been speculating. He had been one of the people who discovered the very risks now threatening her company. "Find everything we have on Elijah Brooks," she said suddenly. Several executives looked up. "Who?" one asked. Rebecca ignored the question. "I want a complete background report. Today." Her legal officer studied her expression. "You know him?" Rebecca hesitated. "Not nearly as well as I should." Less than an hour later, the report arrived. She opened it immediately. The first pages described a career spent investigating corporate fraud, compliance failures, and hidden financial networks. Elijah had advised regulators, major corporations, and investment groups across the country. Several high-profile scandals had been uncovered through his work. The deeper Rebecca read, the worse she felt. Every page revealed another reason she should have listened. Another reason she should have asked questions instead of making assumptions. Then she reached the final section. A photograph appeared beside his professional biography. It was the same calm face she had spent hours trying to avoid on the flight. Rebecca stared at it for several seconds before closing the folder. Somewhere in Seattle, Elijah Brooks was going about his day. And for the first time since boarding that plane, Rebecca realized finding him might be more important than saving the deal. By early afternoon, the situation had deteriorated even further. Rebecca Whitmore stood alone in her office overlooking downtown Seattle while rain clouds gathered once again above the skyline. The conference table behind her sat covered with reports, legal memoranda, and investor communications. Hours earlier, she had been preparing to finalize the largest transaction of her career. Now she was trying to understand how quickly certainty could disappear. Her phone rang continuously. Some calls came from concerned investors. Others came from reporters seeking comments. Several came from business partners who suddenly seemed eager to create distance between themselves and anything connected to Raven Capital. Rebecca answered only a few. Most she allowed to go to voicemail. For the first time in years, she felt completely unprepared. A knock sounded at her office door. Her chief financial officer entered carrying another folder. The look on his face told her everything before he spoke. "Another group has suspended participation," he said quietly. Rebecca closed her eyes. "How many now?" 6. The number hung heavily in the air. He placed the folder on her desk and left without another word. Rebecca opened it slowly. Inside were summaries of investor concerns, regulatory developments, and risk assessments. Nearly every page contained some version of the same conclusion. Uncertainty was spreading. Trust was disappearing. The deal could survive only if answers arrived quickly. Yet the one person who seemed to possess those answers was nowhere to be found. Rebecca opened the report on Elijah Brooks again. This time she studied every detail. His consulting firm, his previous investigations, his professional history. One section caught her attention immediately. Several years earlier, Elijah had helped uncover hidden relationships between financial entities that appeared legitimate on the surface but concealed significant risks beneath layers of complex ownership structures. The pattern sounded painfully familiar. She turned another page, then another. The deeper she read, the clearer the truth became. Elijah had recognized the warning signs long before regulators acted, long before investors became concerned, long before she ever boarded that airplane. A sharp realization settled over her. He had not been trying to impress her. He had not been trying to interfere. He had been trying to help. Rebecca stared out the window. Rain began tapping softly against the glass. In her mind, she saw the flight again. The empty expression she had given him. The dismissive tone. The document she refused to read. The warning she refused to hear. Somewhere in Seattle, Elijah Brooks was living his life completely unaware that she was now searching for him. Or perhaps he already knew and simply did not care. The possibility troubled her more than she expected. Her assistant entered moments later carrying a small note. "We found a possible lead," she said. Rebecca immediately stood. "What kind of lead?" "An industry conference this evening. Elijah Brooks is scheduled to attend." Rebecca took the note and read the address twice. Then she looked back toward the rain-covered city beyond the glass. For the first time all day, she felt something other than fear. Hope. Small, fragile, uncertain, but hope nonetheless. Because if she could find Elijah Brooks, she might finally learn how much damage had already been done, and whether any part of her future could still be saved. The conference center overlooked the Seattle waterfront, its glass walls reflecting the gray evening sky and the lights beginning to appear across the harbor. Rebecca Whitmore arrived just before sunset. The rain had stopped, but the sidewalks still shimmered beneath the fading daylight. Inside, hundreds of professionals filled the lobby. Conversations flowed between investors, consultants, attorneys, and executives gathered for one of the largest risk management conferences in the region. Rebecca moved through the crowd with a sense of urgency she had never experienced before. Just 24 hours earlier, she had entered rooms expecting people to come to her. Tonight she was searching for one man. Her eyes scanned every group, every hallway, every name badge. Finally she saw him. Elijah Brooks stood near a large window overlooking the water. He was speaking with two conference attendees who listened carefully as he explained something on a tablet screen. The same calm expression remained on his face. The same quiet confidence. Nothing about him suggested he was carrying the knowledge that could determine the future of her company. Rebecca stopped several feet away. For a moment, she simply watched. Several people approached Elijah with questions. He greeted each person respectfully. He listened more than he spoke. The contrast between his calm presence and the chaos consuming her life felt almost impossible to ignore. Eventually, the conversation ended and the attendees moved on. Elijah turned and immediately recognized her. Surprise crossed his face, followed by understanding. Neither spoke for a moment. Beyond the glass, ferries moved slowly across the darkening water. "Miss Whitmore," Elijah said politely. Rebecca took a slow breath. "I was hoping I would find you." Elijah nodded. "I had a feeling you might." There was no bitterness in his voice. No satisfaction. Just quiet honesty. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. "Everything you warned me about is happening." Elijah remained silent. The investigation. The investors. The questions. She shook her head. "I should have listened." The noise of the conference seemed distant now. Elijah looked toward the harbor before turning back to her. "I was not trying to tell you what to do," he said. "I only wanted you to see information that might affect your decision." Rebecca felt the weight of those words immediately. He had never demanded trust. He had only asked her to look. "What exactly did you find?" she asked. Elijah reached into his briefcase and removed the same manila envelope that had traveled across the country with him. He placed it gently on a nearby table. Rebecca stared at it. For hours she had thought about those documents. The reports she refused to read. The warning she refused to hear. Elijah opened the folder and carefully spread several pages across the table. Ownership structures. Financial connections. Transaction records. Names she now recognized from the investigation. These patterns appeared months ago, Elijah explained. The problem was not one company. It was the network surrounding it. Rebecca studied the documents. The evidence seemed obvious now, painfully obvious. She looked up at Elijah. If I had listened on the plane. Elijah did not answer immediately. The lights of Seattle reflected across the water behind him. Finally he spoke. You would have asked different questions before signing anything. Rebecca stared at the documents in silence. For the first time since the crisis began, she understood that the greatest mistake she made had happened long before the investigation. It happened the moment she decided she already knew who Elijah Brooks was. The conference center gradually emptied as evening settled over the waterfront. Groups of attendees drifted toward elevators, restaurants, and waiting cars while the lights of Seattle reflected across the dark water outside. Rebecca Whitmore remained standing beside the table where Elijah Brooks had spread out the documents. For nearly 20 minutes, she reviewed page after page in silence. Every chart connected to another chart. Every company connected to another company. The warning signs that now seemed obvious had been hidden beneath layers of complexity, but Elijah had seen them long before anyone else. Finally, she looked up. How long have you known? She asked quietly. Elijah gathered several papers into neat stacks. Long enough to become concerned. Rebecca shook her head. Everyone around me missed this. Elijah offered a small smile. Not everyone. The answer was simple, but it carried no arrogance. That somehow made it harder for her. For years, Rebecca had believed expertise belonged to people who looked successful, sounded successful, and occupied the right rooms. Yet the person who understood the danger better than anyone had been sitting quietly beside her on an airplane while she searched for reasons to dismiss him. The realization stayed with her as they walked toward the lobby together. Outside, the rain had returned. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement in long ribbons of gold. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Rebecca stopped near the entrance doors. I owe you an apology. Elijah turned toward her. For what? Rebecca almost laughed at the question. For the way I treated you from the moment I saw you. The sounds of the city drifted through the glass behind them. Passing cars, distant ferry horns, the soft rhythm of rain. Elijah remained silent. Rebecca lowered her eyes. I made assumptions before you ever spoke. I decided who you were before I knew anything about you. She paused. And when you tried to help me, I refused to listen. Elijah looked out toward the harbor for a moment before answering. You were not the first person to do that. The statement carried no anger. If anything, it sounded tired, as though it came from experience rather than resentment. Rebecca felt a sharp sense of shame. That does not make it right. Elijah nodded slowly. No, it does not. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Honest. Uncomfortable. Necessary. Rebecca looked at him. Can my company recover? Elijah considered the question carefully. The company might. The answer was not reassuring. And the deal? Elijah glanced toward the rain beyond the windows. That depends on whether people still trust the information behind it. Rebecca understood immediately. Trust. The very thing disappearing from every conversation she had that day. Investors were not reacting to headlines alone. They were reacting to uncertainty. The same uncertainty Elijah had tried to prevent. He checked his watch and gathered the last of his documents. I should go. Rebecca nodded. She wanted to ask him to stay. To explain more. To tell her exactly how much trouble lay ahead. Instead, she simply watched him pick up the worn manila envelope. The same envelope she had ignored on the plane. The same envelope that might have changed everything. As Elijah turned toward the exit, Rebecca realized something important. The crisis consuming her company had started with hidden financial risks. But the lesson she would remember had nothing to do with business. It had everything to do with the moment she chose not to see the person sitting beside her. Rebecca left the conference center long after most of the lights had been turned off. Rain drifted through the Seattle night in a fine mist, softening the glow of street lamps and reflecting across nearly empty sidewalks. The city felt quieter than it had the day before. Or perhaps she was finally hearing it differently. Her driver waited at the curb, but she asked him to leave. Instead, she walked. For several blocks, she moved through the cool evening air with no destination in mind. Her phone remained silent for the first time all day. Investors had stopped calling. Attorneys had finished their updates. Reporters had moved on to newer headlines. The crisis was still there, but the noise surrounding it had faded. What remained was the truth. She had spent years building a reputation for seeing opportunities others missed. Yet she had overlooked the most important thing sitting directly beside her. The next morning began with another emergency board meeting. Executives gathered around the long conference table with exhausted expressions. New reports filled every seat. Updated projections flashed across screens. Rebecca listened carefully as attorneys explained regulatory timelines and advisors outlined possible recovery plans. For the first time since the investigation began, she did not interrupt anyone. She did not rush to defend previous decisions. She simply listened. When the presentations ended, the room fell quiet. Everyone waited for her response. Rebecca looked around the table. "We move forward with complete transparency," she said. "No shortcuts, no assumptions, no hiding from difficult questions." Several executives exchanged surprised looks. One board member nodded slowly. Another closed his notebook and leaned back in his chair. The atmosphere shifted almost immediately. It was not optimism. It was trust beginning to return. Later that afternoon, Rebecca sat alone in her office reviewing the documents Elijah had shown her. This time she noticed details she had missed before. Not because the information had changed, because she had changed. The reports were filled with small warnings. Patterns, connections, questions that deserved attention. Questions she never asked because she assumed she already understood the situation. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Her legal officer entered carrying updated projections. "There is some good news," he said. Rebecca looked up. "Good news. Several investors are willing to remain involved if we complete a full, independent review." It was not a victory, but it was not a collapse either. Rebecca thanked him and returned to the window after he left. Rain clouds were breaking apart above the city. Sunlight slipped through narrow openings, casting golden reflections across the water. For a long moment, she simply watched. Then her gaze settled on the manila envelope resting on her desk. The envelope had not saved her company. It had not erased the investigation. It had not restored the deal. What it had done was far more important. It forced her to confront the cost of judging someone before knowing them. 24 hours earlier, she believed the greatest threat to her future was a business risk hidden inside a financial transaction. Now she understood the greater danger had been something else entirely. It had been the certainty that she already knew who deserved to be heard and who did not. 3 months later, Seattle looked very different beneath the clear light of early spring. The storms had passed. The waterfront sparkled beneath a bright blue sky, and sunlight reflected across the glass towers of downtown. From the window of her office, Rebecca Whitmore watched ferries crossing Elliott Bay while employees moved through the streets below. The investigation surrounding Raven Capital was still ongoing, but the worst fears had not become reality. The acquisition had been canceled. Several partnerships had ended. Significant opportunities had been lost. Yet the company survived. More importantly, it survived honestly. Rebecca turned away from the window and looked across her office. The atmosphere felt different now. Simpler, calmer. The oversized presentation boards that once celebrated aggressive growth projections had been replaced by reports focused on accountability and long-term stability. New review procedures had been implemented. Independent oversight had become standard. Decisions were questioned more often. Assumptions were challenged more carefully. The changes had not happened overnight. Neither had the lessons that inspired them. A small framed photograph sat on the corner of her desk. It showed a group of executives attending a recent ethics and leadership conference. Near the edge of the photograph stood Elijah Brooks. He had agreed to advise several organizations, including Rebecca's company, on risk awareness and responsible decision-making. Their relationship never became close in the traditional sense. They did not speak every week. They did not become business partners. Yet a quiet respect had formed between them, one built on honesty rather than appearances. Earlier that morning, Rebecca had received a brief email from Elijah. The message contained only a few sentences. He was traveling to another city for a conference. He hoped business was improving. He wished her well. Nothing more. Nothing less. Rebecca smiled as she reread it. Then she closed the message and walked toward the window once again. Her reflection appeared faintly in the glass. For a moment, she remembered the woman who boarded that airplane months earlier. The woman who believed success gave her the ability to judge people quickly. The woman who saw a seat assignment and immediately decided who belonged beside her and who did not. That version of herself felt strangely distant now. Below, people crossed sidewalks carrying coffee cups, backpacks, briefcases, and shopping bags. Hundreds of lives. Hundreds of stories. Most invisible to anyone passing by. Rebecca watched them for several moments. Then her gaze drifted toward the sky where a passenger jet moved slowly above the city, leaving a thin white trail behind it. Somewhere inside that aircraft, strangers sat beside one another. Some would talk. Some would remain silent. Some would make assumptions. Others would choose curiosity instead. Rebecca understood now how much difference that choice could make. She rested one hand against the cool glass and took a slow breath. The greatest loss she suffered had not been financial. It had not been the canceled acquisition or the damaged reputation or the difficult months that followed. Those things could be rebuilt. The greater loss would have been continuing through life without learning the lesson hidden inside a single flight across the country. A lesson delivered by a man she never bothered to understand until circumstances forced her to look again. Outside, sunlight flooded the city. Inside, the office remained quiet. And in that silence, Rebecca finally understood something that success alone had never taught her. Every person carries a story worth hearing, and sometimes the voice we are quickest to dismiss is the one we need most to hear.